Hello, Stacy. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Totally, it's. I'm excited to talk with you because I know you've been a PodSqueeze user for some time, and I've seen your content out there on Instagram, TikTok, and yeah, tell me about treating your podcast as a scientific process. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, for us, I'll say for me, like I am very much a visionary. I love to come up with ideas kind of entrepreneur. And my team is are the executors on my team. My team are the ones who can really kind of help me to take these big ideas and get them down to actual like action
Hmm.
steps. And so between myself and my team, we really have gotten our podcast to a point where it does like kind of get it operates like a science in the sense that we know we have standard operating agreement, standard operating procedures. We have
Hmm.
really kind of a workflow that we've built that will help us to get our podcast out every week, and also not even just getting it out and getting it published, but also the marketing of the podcast, because that's a place where a lot of podcasters fall short, is that they create the episode, they put it out there, and they don't do a whole lot of marketing to get people to actually listen to the podcast
Yeah,
that
yeah.
it's available. And so everything from ideating on what we're going to talk about to creating the content to passing it off to the editing team,
Hmm.
having them do their thing, having the our blog go up every week, having the email go out every week, and having our promotion on our social media channels happen every week. We really have gotten it down to a science. And it's because we've really taken the time to iron out what that process looks like.
Hmm.
I know sometimes we want to just, create, but we had to take a
Yeah.
step back and say, how do we make sure that every week that we get this podcast out is getting promotion, it's getting out on time,
Hmm.
it's having all the different marketing channels that we wanted to hit. And that way we can make sure that and how are we growing it, right? Like I will make sure
Hmm.
that we're repurposing it for other things. So we really do use our podcast as the anchor of our marketing.
Hmm.
And
It's
because
like
of
a
that,
full
we've had
pipeline already, right? You have like a full pipeline of steps. Now, tell me something. Was it always like this? Like,
It was
did you?
not. It wasn't. We had a podcast before. We had like before Roadmap to 1 Million, which is our current podcast. We had another podcast that was very niche, grew very quickly. Uh, but we didn't have it down to a science. It was very like it took a lot of time to get it out every week. And I
Hmm.
think that because of that, it impacted other areas of the business, right? Like if I'm so
Hmm.
focused on my podcast, I can't focus on the other things I have to focus on as a CEO. And so, but now because we've really decided like this is going to be the center of our marketing, we decided to really kind of like take the time to list out the steps, list out the tools that we use for, different things. We use PodSqueeze to help us to get show notes out and content and all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. And so it really is down to a science now because we're
Hmm.
intentional about making it that way.
Tell me about those crazy days. Do you, like when you first started and you had no process? Were you like feeling stressed that everything like? Uh, did it give you like some kind of anxiety? Do you remember those days where like everything was kind of a little bit messy and going around?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as entrepreneurs, we are okay. Like we have to kind of get through the mess in order to find the magic. And
Hmm.
so
Totally.
with that podcast, it was a lot of like, me staying up to the crack of dawn to get the episode out. My editing team, me getting things to them late. So they would, the podcast would come out late and or my team would be up all night trying to get the podcast out to stay on time.
Hmm.
And that didn't feel good to me as an entrepreneur. That didn't feel good to me as a CEO, like having my team rushing and scrambling to get an episode out on
Yeah.
time or staying up way past their bedtime to get something out because I was late. And so that gave me anxiety because I don't want my team to feel like they are having to scramble and do things last minute. I want to be able to
Hmm.
have my team have enough time to take the time that it takes to edit the podcast, but then also do all the other things like, getting the blog up, getting the email scheduled and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So back then, yeah, it was definitely very chaotic. And now I feel like we have it down to more like a process. And as long as I
Hmm.
get my stuff in on time, then, they have enough time to be able to edit and get things out.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was the chaotic part was in your previous podcast. Now you have another one. Tell us
Yes.
about what is this podcast that you have now.
So our podcast now is called Roadmap to 1 Million, and it is all about marketing your business. So it really is geared
Hmm.
towards CEOs and high level employees who are really in charge of figuring out like, how do we move the business to the next level? How do we take what we have that's already working? We have an offer that works, we're making some sales, but how do we take it to the next level? How do we get to that $1 million mark and beyond? So that is really what the podcast is about. And I've worked with very large brands. I've worked at Zappos, I've worked with Crocs, Adidas, all different kinds of brands. And so I take all of the knowledge that I have and distill it down into different episodes to help people to learn how to run Facebook ads better, how to systematize their marketing, how to support their team better, and really
Hmm.
just be able to learn all of the different aspects of marketing that are going to impact your business.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's great because that's definitely something that is lacking for us podcasters, which is how to get downloads. I think
Mm-hmm.
and I've talked with a lot of podcasters, and what everyone wants in the end is more downloads, more views, and independent. Like, well, actually, that's not totally true. There's also a lot of people that use the podcast as a networking opportunity, as a learning opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of them, I think everyone, like no one likes to talk to the void, right? So it's always good to
Yeah.
have a good platform and the growth plan. So I think I would love to learn more about this. About let's start with like paying ads. Is that something that one can do? Like, can I use paid ads to grow a podcast?
Yeah, definitely. It's something that I talk about a lot when I am talking about Facebook ads because we have a lot of people who now, like, we're in this creator economy where we are
Hmm.
creating a lot of content, whether that's podcasts, whether that's blogs, whether that's YouTube videos. We are creating a lot of content. And the great thing about that is that, we are staying in front of our audience, we're staying top of mind, we're giving them, a lot of value. But the downside to that is that, once you publish an episode 1 week, the next week you promote it for 1 week, and then the next week comes and you have a whole nother episode that you promote,
Yeah.
and the other
Hmm.
episodes really aren't getting as much attention as they deserve because I've had episodes where I'm like, these are really really good episodes, and as you have new people come into your world, maybe they go back and listen to the episodes and binge your podcast, maybe they just listen from that episode forward, but you have a ton of content that you can use and repurpose to be able to get you more
Hmm.
clients. And so what
Yeah.
I like to tell people that if you're trying to grow your podcast, I love Facebook and Instagram ads personally and professionally as the
Okay.
best ad platform to grow your podcast because you have the most space to be able to reach the most amount of people. It has the
Hmm.
best ad tools, and you can really start to kind of find your audience rather than waiting for your
Hmm.
audience to kind of stumble upon you. You can take a
Okay.
really, really good episode and, run ads to it to get people into your marketing ecosystem, to get people into your world. And once somebody starts to listen, and they start to, they really kind of follow your show, they start to consume your content, then they're more likely to become a client. But we don't have to wait for people to come to us, right? Like, there are
We
millions
can
of
go
other
and fetch
podcasts
them.
out there.
Hmm.
So we want
Yeah.
to make sure that we are actively saying like, hey, like I have something of value that I can use as an ad to build my
Hmm.
visibility, to build an audience, to get people into my world.
Hmm.
And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is with ads.
Okay. Let's try to give an example. So let's take this podcast, lessons from a podcaster, where we interview podcasters about their journey and their lessons and everything. How can I set up an ad on, let's say, Instagram or Facebook
Yeah.
to get people to listen to my show?
Yeah, so I've been approached it a couple different ways. And the main way that I like to approach it is I like to look at it as you're taking a really, really good episode, a really specific
Hmm.
episode about a specific topic. And that way, that is what you're putting out there and you're running ads to it. One of the things I will say is that you want to make sure that if you're going to be running ads to your podcast, that you're running ads that you're putting your podcast on your website, because what Facebook has is a pixel, and that Facebook
Hmm.
pixel is able to see, like, when it operates like a bridge between Facebook and your website. And so if you're sending
Right.
traffic to your website, you want to make sure that Facebook is getting those signals back that saying like, oh, this person is
Hmm.
taking the desired action that I want. So let me send more people that way. If you're
Hmm.
sending your ads to a podcast player, that tracking is going to break because you don't own the podcast player, so you can't place a pixel there.
Yeah.
And so what happens is you're just going to send traffic one way, but Facebook is not getting those signals back to say, did this person actually wait for the page to load? Did they consume the content? Did they take the desired action? right? And so
Ah,
what
that's
I like to
cool.
say is take one really good episode of your podcast, create it, put it on your site somewhere as like a blog post, and so you can get that some of that SEO traffic as well. But then start running ads to that, and you
Mhm.
really want to make sure that you use a specific episode versus you just saying like, "Hey, I have a podcast, come listen," because you want to make sure you're capturing the right people's attention, right? Like you want
Mhm.
to get something talk to someone very specific, and I'll give you an example. Um, I
So,
have
but
an
in this
episode.
case, so let's say in this case, it's if it's for podcasting, right?
Mhm.
How, or for podcasters, how would this, first of all, the ads, I think, by the way, what you just said with the pixel makes a lot of sense, and people sometimes forget about that, which is important to give back information to Facebook and Instagram and etc. But for me, what would be the hook? The ad would be like a videogram, an audiogram, a text, an image. What is the best way to get people to then see my ad and say, okay, I wanna click on it.
Hmm. Yeah, I like to use the like video clips, specifically. I think video ads
Hmm.
convert really well. And so whether that is you talking about your podcast, so you're setting up your camera and just talking about, hey, this episode is about blah blah blah, it's for this person, click the link to
Hmm.
go listen to it. Or you're pulling a clip from your podcast, a really juicy clip from your podcast, and
Hmm.
using that as the ad so that people can start to consume it and say, like, oh, that's really interesting. And then they're going to click on your link and then they're going to go check it out. And if they're interested, they'll follow
Hmm.
your show or they'll go to the podcast player of their choice and they'll listen to it. But I like to really kind of figure out like
Yeah.
pulling a piece of it that really kind of hooks people and gives people, that interesting insight. I think that that's the best way
Hmm.
to go with the
And
creative.
what hooks people? Like what is the trick to make a great hook?
The first step before you're thinking about a hook is really nailing down your messaging. And so
Mm.
and that's the thing that a lot of people are missing with their Facebook ads is that they're thinking that they can just say, "Hey, come listen to my podcast because it's amazing." But there
Mm.
are a lot of other amazing podcasts. There's a lot of ads that people are saying.
Yeah.
You're competing
Yeah.
with a lot of different attention on Facebook and Instagram. And so when you're thinking about who is the person that's going to be listening to this? What do they want to get out of it? Right? Like, someone who's a podcaster, it's not just enough to say, hey, podcasters, come listen to my podcast. Because all podcasters don't want to grow their podcast. And some podcasters want to use their podcast in different ways. Some people, who may be a podcaster, they may be just starting out and they're not
Yeah.
ready. They don't need your kind of like, your information. Maybe they need someone who can teach them how to start a podcast. So if you have a podcast about how to start a podcast, great, you talk to those people. But if you have a more advanced podcast, more higher level podcast of people who already are podcasters and they're finding
Hmm.
ways to be more efficient with their workflow, they're finding more ways to grow their audience. Infuse that in your messaging. And so from there,
Mm.
once you nail down your messaging and know who you're talking to and what is going to draw them into your podcast specifically, then that's when you create your hooks. That's when you figure out what pieces of of your
Mm.
podcast that you're going to use to actually be able to hook them in, right? Because it starts with really understanding
Okay.
who are we talking to, what do they care about,
So you
right?
need to kind of figure out what is the problem, and correct
Mhm.
me if I'm wrong, but what is the problem that your podcast is fixing? Like
Yeah.
why people want to listen to it, and that's your hook. Then you'll be like, let's say I want to help people to start a podcast, right?
Hmm.
And I have an episode with how to set up your mic.
Hmm.
So the hook could be something here are three techniques that everyone gets wrong about, or how to set up a mic, for instance.
Hmm.
And is that would that work?
Yeah, definitely. Because when you're thinking about it, like, if your podcast, you have a ton of content in there. Right. But what you
Mhm.
want to do is you want to get someone in a very specific mindset, right? Like if someone is starting their podcast and the main thing that's holding them back is they haven't figured out what mic to use yet. And that's keeping them from recording content. That's keeping them from
Mhm.
moving forward with their podcast. That is a person that is in a very specific position that you want to be able to target and get them to let them know that you have the solution that they're looking for, right? You're like, don't let
Mhm.
this, don't let not having a microphone keep you from starting your podcast. Don't let it hold you
Mhm.
back anymore. Here's an episode, listen to this episode, and I'll give you all the techniques that you need to move forward. And then maybe you have an affiliate play in there, right? Maybe you have an affiliate product in there that you're,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
mic that
Yeah. Yeah.
specifically that you're talking about, because then
Mhm.
that's where you know how you connect it to monetizing it, right?
Mhm.
So you really want to make sure that you're focused on people who are in a very specific mindset and letting them know that you're kind of like giving them a quick win, right? Like, giving them a really like, hey, oh, they solved my problem with this, with letting me know what mic I need to use. And so now I'm gotten some value as a consumer. And then, yeah, I want to follow the show and I want to reciprocate and I want to support and share and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But if you're just
Yeah.
running ads that just says, hey, if you're a podcast and you want to grow your podcast, listen to my podcast, it's like, I mean, that's a little flat, right? That kind of like just blends in with all the other people who are talking about
Yeah,
growing your
totally.
podcast.
Stacy, my biggest issues with ads is that sometimes I feel that it just sucks all my money. I'm like, I put it out, and then in an hour, it just sucked 50 euros or dollars, and I don't see the results.
Hmm.
So that discouraged me a lot. Is this something that one can fix, or is it normal even to like waste, not waste, but to lose money at first until it actually starts growing?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's a common fear that people have, and it happens, right? Like people do feel like they put ad money in and they're not getting the results back. But what I tell people when they come across me with that thing is, I'm like, okay, what is the desired result? Like, what do we want? What are we tracking here? Are we tracking
Hmm.
downloads? Like, are we looking to just increase our downloads? Because maybe we're going for a brand partnerships kind of play, right? And we want to increase our downloads so that way we can get more brands and more commercials
Hmm.
and that kind of thing. If that's the metric, if that's the goal, that's what we're measuring and that's what we're building our campaigns around. If we're trying to get sales, which a lot of podcasters are trying to get sales with their podcasts, especially like my podcast really is a
Hmm.
tool
Lead
to nurture
magnet.
my
Hmm.
audience to get them to move to become clients. And so what I have to think about is, what does my customer journey look like, right? Like from when someone comes into my world to when they buy from me, what is that journey? Everybody's going to go on a journey. It's kind of like, if you think about it, it's like a bridge, like where that
Hmm.
person is on one side, what they want is on the other side, or your offer is on the other side. And you have to use your marketing to make them to take those steps across the bridge. So that way they can get to that point that they are ready to buy your offer. And
Hmm.
so things like, having lead magnets that help people to give people a quick win to get on your email address, to get on your email list, having a welcome sequence in place that kind of like, gives people all the information that they need to sell them, to make them to want to become a client of
Hmm.
yours. And then also understanding that ads are very much a long-term kind of play. A lot of people think that
Okay.
you're going to jump into ads and that you're going to, put $10 in
Yeah,
and you
it's
get
it's the magic
$50
pill.
back.
Yeah.
But that's just not how it works, because even regardless of how people come into your world, right? That's why I tell people to think about their customer journey. Because if you realize that it takes people 3 months of sitting on your email list before they buy from you, whether they come in organically, whether they come in through an ad, you're really kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you're looking at your ad performance by only like a week, right?
Hmm.
And so you have to understand what your particular sales cycle is as the business owner, to understand what are the different touch points that I have to have with clients in order for them to buy from me. Like, for example, for myself, people love to hear me speak. When I speak to people, when I get them on sales calls, that's when I sell people. And so my
Hmm.
goal with my podcast is to create content that moves them closer to booking a sales call with me.
Hmm.
And so I even take some of my past podcast content, I infuse it in my welcome sequences to get people hearing my voice, get people hearing my methodology. I have emails that go out to say, hey, book a sales call with me.
Hmm.
I have commercials inside of my podcast that tell people to, hey, take my quiz or something like that, to get people to take that next step of from becoming a passive listener to actually be getting and putting them in my sales cycle. And if
Hmm.
you're using your ads to do, your ads as a way to get more people into your world, you still have to warm them up. You still have to get them used to
Got
hearing
it.
your voice and what you have to say. And so
But
that's
how
what
do
I
you
would say.
track
Look at
that?
that customer journey.
How do you track that? Because if it's with a 3 months, 4 months window, how do you know that this person that is now converting came through an ad?
Well, I make sure that I tag all my people that come in through ads. And so
Mm.
whenever someone comes into and I also create ad specific landing pages. And so if I'm running an
Mm.
ad to something, if I have say if I'm doing a live workshop, for example, and I have a landing page, I use one landing page for my organic traffic and I use another landing page for my paid traffic. And
Ah.
anybody who comes in through this paid landing page gets also tagged that they came in through a Facebook ad, or that they came in through a specific type of ad.
That's
And
really
then when you're
smart.
going in and you're looking at your CRM, you're looking at your
Mm.
email service providers. That's when you can really start to figure out, like, what is that? What are the touch points that people have had with me before they, kind of actually buy from me. So I can look at one subscriber and see, okay, they came in through a Facebook ad, they watched a webinar, They downloaded a thing, they took my quiz, they did. These are all the things that that person has done before they booked a sales call with me. And so the tracking is not perfect, especially coming from podcasts, because we know we have to put them in the podcast player, and so
Right.
eventually most people are going to listen on, on their phone or something like that. So that's not perfect, right? That it's not to say that the tracking is, the best ever, but that's just how I do it. I just make sure that if I'm running ads to something, I run ads to a separate page. So that way on the back end, I can just
Yeah,
tag
it's
and
really
say everybody
smart.
who's
Yeah.
came in through there
Yeah.
came through an ad.
And how do you set up all of this? Is there like any tools you can recommend to set up all of this tracking and creating landing pages and tagging people?
Yeah,
What
I
tools
mean,
you
you can
recommend?
use a lot of landing page softwares out there will allow you to do this. What I personally I use ConvertKit, and so with my email for ConvertKit, you're able to tag people with certain things. You're able to create as many landing pages as you want, or as many forms and things that you
Mhm.
want. And it's just really about making sure that when you're setting it up, you're just intentional with how you're setting this up. If I know I'm going to be running ads, I'm going to duplicate the exact same page and just put the URL that says like ads only or something like that.
Mhm.
And then just making sure I tag people that come through that particular thing. So it's not something that's necessarily complicated. It's more so just making sure that the tools
Mhm.
you're using allow you to segment your audience and tag your audience based on their
Mhm.
behaviors. And
Mhm.
I know people who use Active Campaign, and there's a connection between Facebook and Active Campaign that you can look at. So there's a lot of ways to really kind of be able to track. Google Analytics is another thing. I always apply UTMs to any ads that I'm running, so I can look in
Mhm.
Google Analytics to see how much traffic was coming through there, how many sales
Mhm.
came through these particular ads. And if you're setting your Google Analytics up correctly, then you can see where your sales are coming from. And you
Mhm.
can really start to see, like, have UTMs tagged at different places to be able to see
Mhm.
where those specific sales came from. So it really is about just intentionally looking at setting up your pages and things like that to make sure that you
Mhm.
are, able to track what you want to track.
And I can see that one thing as well, that analytics are key as well.
Hmm.
Being able to know what's happening, what's working, what's not working. Now,
Yeah.
tell me something, Stacey. How does PodSqueeze come into play? Like, how do you use PodSqueeze to repurpose your content?
Yeah, so we use PodSqueeze in a couple different ways. The main way we use PodSqueeze is to write our show notes and to get us like some social media clips. So we will actually just take the file, upload it into PodSqueeze. It gives us our show notes, and we'll take those show notes, and we use our show notes
Hmm.
as the show notes on the podcast player. But then we also
Right.
use those show notes as a blog post. And then I
Oh,
also,
okay.
whenever I'm creating content, I have a certain number of pieces of posts that I do for my podcast every week. And so then I go into PodSqueeze and I'm like, okay, let me look at the captions that y'all have that y'all can, pull for us. And I'll pull out the ones that I like the best. And then I'll tweak them. I'll add my own language, say this, say that, how I say things. We'll tune it a little bit to kind of get it as close to our voice as possible. But that's really the main way that we use it. It helps us more so in the getting the podcast out phase and like that
Hmm.
workflow of getting it published, as well as being able to take some of the audio clips or some of the captions and then using that for promotion.
Right. So, as well, a little bit as a brainstorming, right? Like, it takes also some ideations, and also for the show notes, I think it's where people use it the most. Um, yeah, I think, well, there was a lot to unpack here. There was
Mhm.
a lot of information. I guess, obviously, people, if they want to learn more about it, they can listen to your podcast, because that's you. I assume that you also go in detail into all of these kind of little tricks and tips on how to grow a podcast. As a kind of a closing down question, let's say someone is just starting out, and obviously when they are starting out, they don't know what UTMs are, and setting up ads, and what is a pixel and everything. What is the basic setup? Like, let's say someone is starting out, what should they just focus? Okay, you don't have unlimited time because you have whatever, kids, full-time job, but you want to start out. So what would be the basic setup that you'd recommend for someone starting out?
Yeah, if you're just starting out, honestly, I would say with the way that I teach ads and the way that I look at ads is that they're an amplifier. And so when you're just starting out and you don't know what's working for your podcast, you don't know which episodes are bringing you the most clients, then really kind of focus on your organic efforts instead. Because paid, you can turn on paid at any time. I think people sometimes think that they're going to miss the wave
Hmm.
if they don't start ads right when they begin their business. Ads are
Right.
not going anywhere. Facebook's not going anywhere, right? Like, so focus on really kind of getting your workflow down, and also focus on being able to promote your podcast organically. So you can start to see what works. Like, what are the what are the topics that really hit with my audience? How am I building my audience? And, are the podcast episodes that I'm creating, are they leading to the desired action, which may be a sale, maybe a lead, maybe you just want downloads because you want to grow your podcast and get brand deals, right? Like, take the time to figure out the purpose of your podcast, how to, get into a groove of creating your episodes and promoting your episodes and things like that, finding the right channels that work for you. Because, hey, like, if you promoting your podcast on TikTok is what's getting you the best result, then maybe the next step for you is to run TikTok ads, not to just go jump on
Right.
Facebook just because I said so. Right. And so take the time to really figure out what is working in your business and what is working for your podcast. And that is really going to tell you which way to move. Right. And so, excuse me, focus on also making sure that you're posting your podcast on your website, because then you're going to start to get SEO traffic. And then that helps you to set you up for when you are looking to run ads, right? Because you can install your pixel on your website at any time, whether you're running ads or not. I definitely recommend installing the Facebook pixel on your site, because when you do that, it's building an audience for you, whether you're running ads or not, because then you can go into Facebook and say, hey, anybody who's visited my website in the last 90 days, show them this particular ad. So what I would say to beginners is, one, master your organic marketing. Really start to, get into a groove of getting your podcast out there, growing your audience, getting downloads, getting people into your world. Two, make sure that you're posting your podcast on your blog or on your website so that you're getting that SEO traffic, and you have a place to send people that you own, rather than having to send it to a podcast player that you don't own. And then the third thing is making sure you're understanding like what works in your podcast or what works in your business. And then when you understand that, that's when you're ready to kind of light it on fire with ads. So like, as I mentioned, like if Pinterest is your channel, run Pinterest ads. I run ads on all different platforms. I used to, work at Zappos, and I ran ads on all the different social platforms. And so I pick Facebook and Instagram because that's the channels that I like. We get the best performance there, and that's mostly works for my clients. But if you're seeing that Pinterest is driving a ton of traffic to your podcast, then your next step is Pinterest ads, rather than saying, let me go to Facebook. And so that's why it's so important to just understand what works first.
And there's one thing that I think is really important to ask, which is expectations. What shall I expect? So let's say I'm trying it out, and how do I know that TikTok works better than Instagram? So because it can be that I have a few more downloads on TikTok or Instagram, but maybe I have, like, instead of 2 downloads, I have 4 downloads. So what should be the expectation for someone starting out? Is it shall we expect that it grows really fast? Or is it like it takes some time? Does it not grow at all for the first 5-10 episodes, and then it starts building up? What are the expectations people should have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that really you have to really set your expectations based on the effort that you're putting in to grow your podcast. And I say that, and it may sound a little bit harsh, but I come across a lot of podcasters. I come across a lot of business owners. And a lot of times people say to me, they're like, oh, I want to grow my podcast. And I'm like, okay, well, what are you doing to grow your podcast? I'm like, oh, I post about it once a week. Once a week, that's not a lot. That's really kind of, minimal, right? Like a new episode comes out, you say, hey, I have a new episode out, and then that's it, right? But if that is what you're doing, then you're not going to significantly grow your podcast. So pick a channel, dominate that channel, give something at least 90 days of really kind of going hard on that channel to really kind of figure out, what is it, is this channel working for me? Am I increasing my downloads? I post my podcast at least 3 times a week, and there are other times when I just jump on stories and I just talk about what the new episodes and stuff like that. But I talk about my podcast a lot. I integrate it into my marketing. I send out an email about my podcast every week. We post a blog post about our podcast every week. And so your expectation is really going to be, should be matching your output. So if you're only talking about your podcast once a week, you can't expect to have this significant growth. If you're talking, but if you're integrating your podcast into your marketing fully and building a system around it, then you can expect to see your podcast growing every week, or, every couple weeks. You'll start to really kind of see that significant growth. Also, are you growing your audience? Because if you're only talking about your podcast to the same people, you're not going to see a lot of growth. So you have to make sure that you're also adding new people into your world. So like for me, my main channel is Facebook. And so I'm always adding new people to my Facebook. I'm always inviting people to like my page. I'm inviting people to join my email list, because another place I get a lot of downloads is when I send an email out, I get a burst of emails. I mean, a burst of downloads, because they're like, oh, she has a new episode out. Let me go to my podcast player and, listen to the episode. Right. And so your expectations really should match the effort that you're putting in to grow your podcast, because a lot of people will turn to a podcast, they create amazing content, and they expect people to just come. That's just not how things work. You just, you building it and creating it is not going to drive people to it. You have to actually market it. You got to put in the work. So figure out what channel, start out on some different channels based on where you think your audience is. Like if you're, a Pinterest audience, maybe a little different than a Facebook audience or a LinkedIn audience or something like that, right? Figure out where your people are hanging out, go hard on that channel, promote your podcast,
like 2 months, 3 months, go hard.
At least a couple months, I would say.
Yeah.
I would say go hard on the channel for a couple months.
That's great feedback, Stacy. I think you said it all. If people just share it once a week or so, nothing will happen. They cannot expect. But if you go hard on something, you should expect some results. And if you don't have them, maybe you should kind of revisit your strategy. Stacy, tell me, again, the name of your podcast. Where can we find you? Tell us everything so that people can, stop this and go listen to you.
Yeah, definitely. So my podcast is called Roadmap to 1 Million. You can find it on all the podcast players. And you can also check out my site, stacyzeal.co, is where I post all my, my workshops and my quiz and all different things that you can do to learn how to improve your marketing. And then you can also follow me on Instagram, Facebook. I'm at stacyzeal.co on all the different platforms. So looking forward to connecting with y'all.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I think we've learned a lot from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by PodSqueeze, an essential tool for podcasters that creates show notes, timestamps, clips, and more. Visit podsqueeze.com and use the code PODCASTER for 20% discount in the first 3 months. We release a new episode every Tuesday and Thursday. See you in the next episode of Lessons from a Podcaster.